Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this event hosted by the Institute for Policy Research. My name is David Klemperer. I'm a research assistant here at the IPR, and I'll be chairing today's event with Liam Byrne. Liam is the Labour MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and Solihull North, and currently chairs the House of Commons Select Committee on Business and Trade. He previously served in Gordon Brown's cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury and as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Alongside his distinguished political career, Liam is a prolific writer. He is the author of more than 20 publications on economics, foreign policy and public service reform, and is also the author of the recent books The Inequality of Wealth, Why It Matters and How to Fix It, and of course, Why Populists Are Winning and How to Beat Them. It's the latter book that Liam is going to talk to us about today. It's a great book. I've read it. I'd strongly recommend it, but I'm not going to talk about it. Liam's going to talk about it. The way this is going to work is that Liam will talk for about 30, 35, 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. I should say in advance that this event is being filmed. If you're in the audience, you won't appear on video, but if you ask a question, that will be recorded. So please just be aware of that. Anyway, I will now invite Liam to begin his talk.
Great. David, thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everybody. So thank you very much indeed for coming along. So the IPR, I guess lots of people know the IPR here. It's a really important part of the public policy infrastructure in our country now. And Nick Pearce and I worked together at Number 10 many years ago. And so it's been just a real privilege for me to kind of watch the IPR kind of grow in force and strength and influence. And it's down to, Nick's brilliant leadership, but also some brilliant people working with it, like David. However, when you get invited to these things, you always kind of say yes, because your publisher just sort of says, look, you need to get out there and shift some books, mate. But you never quite know sort of what you're walking into. So thank you for coming tonight. I have this kind of paranoia about coming to meetings and there not being anybody there, which kind of, it owes back to when I joined the Labour Party as a 15-year-old back in Harlow in Essex in 1986. And, joining the Labour Party in Harlow in those days was not a normal thing for a 15-year-old to do. And so I got a call the day I joined from somebody professing to be what's called the CLP secretary, saying, oh, look, it's great, you've joined the Labour Party, you're only 15, that's marvellous, you should come along to this meeting we're having tonight. And this sounded very exciting. And he said, but I've got to warn you, there's going to be a huge row. And I was a bit trepidatious at that point. And then I think sensing my trepidation, they said, but don't worry, there's also going to be a lot of drinking, which obviously, my spirits lifted. And then he said, and then there'll be a group hug and a song. And I think at that point I was sort of about to leave the Labour Party. But being a sort of a polite young mouse, I said, well, what time do you want me to come along then? He said, well, it doesn't matter really, it'd just be me and you. And so whenever I kind of come along to these kind of meetings and it's more than me and David, I'm delighted. So thank you very much for coming. Right, so the origin of this book goes back to The Inequality of Wealth, which was published a couple of years ago, which sets out this kind of yawning division that we have across the West, but in our country between the haves and the have-nots and the won't-haves. And when it came out, a few people said to me, well, look, you now need to put the politics on top of the economics and explain what is going to happen if we don't fix this yawning inequality, because what we're going to get is the rise of a populism that's going to be quite dangerous. And so the book is short. It's because it was written in the course of just 12 months, and people don't read long books anymore, David, I'm told. So the book is quite short. But the more I kind of thought about it, the more I realised that it was a book that was needed, because we're basically now at one of these once-in-a-500-year moment. So power in the world is shifting. If we're lucky, we will get from the kind of hegemony that the Americans built after World War II to a kind of a concert of powers by about 2040. But this sort of transition is going to be really disruptive and quite dangerous. And this is the worst moment in Western history for us to be ruled by a group of people who have three things in common. One, they are unfortunately characterized by a posture of appeasement towards Russia. Second, they're pretty autocratic at home. But third, they're avaricious pretty much everywhere. And so that combination of appeasement, autocracy, avarice is the worst possible combination that we could have in our political leaders at this moment of political flux. And yet, think back to 2024. What happens in 2024? 2 billion people go and vote. It's one of democracy's biggest years. And who are the big winners? Well, populist leaders on the authoritarian right are amongst the biggest winners. So, according to some stats, they basically now wield power in about a quarter of the world's democracies. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to try and achieve in the book was to shake the centrists, the centre ground on both right and left, out of what I saw as a kind of a complacency that somehow this was a blip, somehow this was a one-off, somehow things were going to kind of revert to the type of politics that we had before. And I do not believe that that is what is going to happen. And the reason that I think that is because if you look at these kind of fundamental drivers of populism, they're all about to get sharper, not weaker, over the years to come. So the great disillusion with the global economy that we built after 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, that is really pronounced. I'll go into a couple of figures that just illustrate that. This kind of disillusionment with the economy that has been created, that's potentially about to get more pronounced as artificial intelligence really affects, in particular, young people's fortunes in the labour market, or the fortunes of those without skills, or the fortunes of those that left school early. Second, the great division in our society, which has come about through the destruction of social capital in many communities, and the new kind of divide and rule politics you see in social media, that too could be about to get much worse, not least because of artificial intelligence too. And then third, this kind of new age of human movement, this kind of increase in migration that we've seen in recent years, that too may be about to get stronger, may not diminish. About 1.2 billion people are going to join the labour market in emerging economies over the next 10 to 15 years. At best, 400 million jobs are forecast in those economies. So where are the other 800 million people going to go? It's quite possible that in search of the quiet miracle of a normal life, they move beyond the places that they were born. So all of these things, all of these secular trends could be about to get stronger, not weaker, over the years to come. And so to dismiss populism as a blip, I think, is a fundamental mistake, not least because what history teaches us is that these forces are one thing, but a stock market crash is quite another. And it's not hard to find people who forecast a stock market crash on the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange today controls about 40% of global equity values. If that crashes, the consequences will be severe. And yet governments around the world are already leveraged up to the nines. There's not a lot of fiscal headroom left. Their ability to react to a serious crash is actually now quite constrained. So it's not hard to see how you might have a rhyme with the late 1920s and the early 1930s when extremism rose very dangerously in the wake of an economic problem. So what the book tries to do then is to try and bring to what's been a vibes-led field of policy and debate some data and analysis. And this is what the book tries to do. It tries to set out what is the market for populism, so who is voting for populists. That's the kind of demand side, if you like. But the most original work in the book is on the supply side. So what is the message? What is the media? What is the money? What's the magical thinking that makes up the way that populist leaders go to market and actually win power? And that's the rough structure of the book. So let me just kind of start with a few lessons on the market. This is obviously a UK picture, not an international picture. But what it basically shows you, this is from Jane Green, who was my mentor at Nuffield a couple of years ago. What it basically shows you is that you can see here the bulk, the lion's share of the reform vote is coming from the Conservative Party. You know, the Labour Party is losing maybe about 1 in 10 of its supporters to reform. when you're an MP from the Labour Party and that's happening in your seat, I can tell you it feels pretty uncomfortable. But step back, what's happening in the country, it's about 1 in 10. So by and large, the reform vote is a revolt on the right. But what the book tries to do is it tries to bring together some quantitative research and some qualitative research to try and understand a little bit more about what are the things that unite reform voters and what are the things that differentiate them one from another. What I found is that 5 things characterise most reform curious and reform voters. So 1, they're under pressure. They feel sharply the inequality of progress that's characterised the last kind of 15 years. They can see some doing really very nicely, thanks very much. But when they're looking at what's happening to them, they are disappointed with what has happened to them, and they're quite worried about what is going to happen to them as they head into retirement. Reform voters skew older, so they will often be, there may be some disability in the family, there may be some unsecured debts in the family, there may be real worries and struggles in the labour market. They're worried about heading into retirement, a life on a fixed income with unsecured debts. That feels quite risky to them. Second, they're profoundly pessimistic about the future. So the majority of those who are reform curious and reform voters feel that their wealth is going to diminish, not increase over the years to come, and they overwhelmingly think that life will be much worse for the next generation. Third, and this is much underrated, they feel they're living in precarious communities. So 80% of the most hardcore reform voters say that their community is in decline, and they're net negative about the strength of community spirit in their area. The social capital of the communities around them feels like it has disappeared, it's evaporated, and they have no sense of agency about how they're going to change that. These 3 things mean that they feel acutely dispossessed about their place in the queue, which is why people are so angry about immigration. And it's worth saying that all groups of reform voters would prioritise immigration reform and border control as their number 1 issue. And then finally, they are absolutely incandescent at what they see as a broken politics, a politics and a group of politicians that have let them down, that raise taxes and waste those taxes on things that are stupid and wrong. And by and large, pretty much all the reform voters that we've been able to study have those kind of 5 things in common. But underlying it, this is perhaps one of the biggest reasons why. So democracy's broken promise helps explain why people feel as they do now and why they feel about the future as they do. So before the financial crash, average wages across most major like OECD countries were growing at about 1.7% a year. What that means, if your wages are growing at 1.7% a year, that means that your wages take about 42 years to double. So over the course of a lifetime, you could expect your wages to increase 2-fold. But since the financial crash, average wages are growing at 0.6% a year. That means it takes 109 years for your wages to double. So once upon a time, your wages, you could forecast them doubling over a lifetime. Now it's over a century, over the course of a couple of generations. When you couple that with what many people are experiencing locally, things begin to get a bit clearer. This is some of the kind of output from the ethnographic study that we did, but frankly I could have written this in parts of my own constituency. High streets shuttered, all those kind of shops that have closed down, the kind of organised crime takeover of the high street that the BBC's been highlighting over the last couple of weeks. Local services shut down from austerity, the kind of, the fly tipping that we see. What I found campaigning as a politician after COVID is that where once we thought politics had become local, now it was hyper-local. That kind of space between your front door, the green space where you walk the dog, and the shop where you buy the milk, that kind of triangle, that's your lens through which you look at the world. And when it looks like this, when it's out of control and you can't do anything about it, that has a profound impact on the wealth that you feel that you have. When it's out of control, you feel powerless, out of options or agency. And so people, what do they say when you knock on their door? They say, well, look, I just want to move. I just want to get out. But actually, I don't have the financial resources to do that. And so I feel trapped. And because I feel trapped, I feel angry. I feel angry at you for not solving my problem. So that kind of combination of a kind of a real pressure on living standards and a pessimism about whether they'll improve, the collapse of expectations at a time that people can see some people doing really very well, coupled with that sense of local decline and the collapse of social capital. Those two, I think, are the most kind of fundamental forces. So that's the demand side. That's what we kind of learned about the kind of fundamentals for why people are voting for right-wing populists. The book then sort of just changes the lens a bit to look at then some of the things that are going on the supply side. And we started off by just asking ourselves, well, what do populist leaders talk about? What do they say? How do they campaign? How do they go to market? And so the way that we did this is we basically built a massive kind of database of populist speeches. So we took speeches from Maloney, from Orban, Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, some of the far right in Holland, Trump, Farage, Tice. And we kind of ran a semantic analysis across the top of it. And what emerged from that really surprised me. A couple of things surprised me. One is how consistent the messages are across that wide arc of politicians. But second, how stable the messages are going back 20 or 30 years. Basically, these three tropes emerged as the kind of the three corners of the populist message. So one is a sense of national renewal, make America great again. Is the obvious example, but it's drenched in the language of ethno-civilizational decline. And that ethno-civilizational decline is something that Orban was the great orator of, but actually he was taking a tradition that you could trace back to the paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan in America, stood against George Bush, back to the Nouvelle Droite of the French in the 1960s, back to Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, published in Germany in the late 1920s. There's a really long philosophical tradition that has now got mixed up with the great replacement theory that the French far right introduced to it in the 60s and 70s. And it is really, really consistent. This idea that we as a civilization, the white Christian civilization, is in decline and it is being jeopardized by Mexicans or Muslims or migrants. It's a really tight trope that goes back over a century of thinking on the far right. Second, nostalgia and a hunger for something lost. Populist language is freighted in the words of time. The use of language, the use of time as a recurring motif, because time and time and time and time again. And I actually become convinced that this nostalgia is about a hunger for something lost, which is local. As people feel that their communities have changed and often declined, people are kind of looking back with rosy retrospection about how things used to be. People talk about, why is there no butchers on the high street anymore? What's happened to the greengrocers? What about that river that we used to swim in? What about the green space where we used to play that wasn't kind of covered in syringes and broken glass? People have this kind of sense of something that they've lost that has been local. And then finally, of course, the summons to action, the sense of emergency, crisis, struggle that, of course, can only be solved by a strongman leader. A trope for the far right that goes back, of course, over a century. So that's a bit about the messaging. And of course, the messaging, that message, it struggled to get through for a lot of the last kind of 40 to 50 years. But the advent of social media changed everything. Why? Because populist language is freighted with conflict, anger, and of course, once you had the algorithmic amplification that comes along with Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all of a sudden, there is a business model that is designing social media systems, what some call outrage machines, to actually amplify that kind of rage. And so the fact that we have, if you like, some of the most valuable and important companies on earth which have a business model for spreading this stuff is a gift to the populist preachers, because one is seeking votes, the other is seeking profits, but both in their own way are seeking power. What we sought to do, though, is we worked with a data science company called Signify to try and get a handle on how this digital ecosystem actually looked in the UK. And so we took three nodes. We basically took Nigel Farage, GB News, and Matt Godwin. And we just kind of looked on Twitter just to see what was going on. And we basically, those three accounts have about 1 to 2 million followers. So we took the 30,000 most important accounts, scraped who they were following, and this picture emerged. This is the network analysis that emerged. And the extraordinary thing is that when you look at who these people are following, who these 30,000 people who follow these guys are following, they're overwhelmingly American. In fact, somewhere between three-quarters and two-thirds and three-quarters of the accounts that they're following, the most influential accounts in this system, are American. So for all of the boasts about taking back control and the sovereignty of the nation, the populist ecosystem in this country is just another node in an American network. Now, that is not an accident, because if you take the oldest advice in political journalism to follow the money, an extraordinary picture emerges. And things are now moving so quickly that already this picture is out of date. So we basically tracked about 5,000 transactions over the course of 4 or 5 years. And what emerged was a picture that no one had really seen before. We found about £173 million had gone in, by and large, from 4 men. Christopher Chandler, who controls Legatum, Paul Marshall, Jeremy Hoskins and Christopher Harborne. And they had basically assembled this media political complex. Now, at the core of it was GB News. But of course, GB News is then a fountainhead for populist politicians because it pays them so much money. And of course, the content that they create is then leveraged through ad share revenue on social media networks as well. Some of the money, as you can see, is going into the political party directly. Some's going into think tanks like Prosperity Institute, which used to be Legatum. You've got a couple of other kind of magazines, Reclaim Party. Alliance for Responsible Citizenship is a joint venture with Jordan Peterson from the US, brings people from around the world together. Mr. Farage, of course. Net Zero Watch campaigns against climate change policy and personal donations. Now, you know, the extraordinary thing is that this picture is already 25 million quid short, because just in the last few months alone, Mr. Harborne, who has made his money in cryptocurrency, I'll come back to in a sec, has put another chunk of change into reform, and of course, just yesterday, was exposed as providing £5 million in undeclared donations to Nigel Farage. So, you know, we're now looking at about 200 million over the course of 5 or 6 years. It's a huge amount of money assembled in plain sight. I mean, it took us quite a lot of work to put all this together, but the data's available. You can get it from Companies House and the Electoral Commission and the Register of Interest. Just nobody kind of knitted it together. But the stunning thing for me was how much money was going into building the media part of the system. And I'm convinced now that we cannot understand British politics or Western politics without looking at the media political complex in the round. And the thing that really shocked me in a way was to then get into researching the theory behind this. Because many of the folk that were involved in architecting this have been studying, of all people, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And for those of you who know Gramsci, Italian communist, imprisoned, writes the prison notebooks, develops this notion that actually revolutions are wars of position. You have to kind of dominate the cultural highlands if you're to win in politics. It's actually summarised by Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News, in the phrase, politics is downstream of culture. These folks had understood that they needed to build a culture system if they were to win a political fistfight. And sure enough, they have just spent £200 million building exactly that in the course of just 5 or 6 years. The scale of this is extraordinary. Now, I sit on the Joint Committee of National Security Strategy. One of the things that we have been studying for some time now is the influence of dark money in politics, because this is the money that you can document. But I can assure you there are tens of millions of pounds that we can't document that are on the margins of these proxies too. Some of those proxies, take for example Nathan Gill, recently imprisoned for spying for Russia, some of those proxies are deriving their money from the Russian intelligence service. The CIA estimates are that over the last 10 years, about over $1 billion has been provided by the Russian intelligence service into the bank accounts of Western proxies. Russian intelligence service obviously took quite a big setback after the Salisbury poisonings, when so many, about 200 RAS officers were expelled from Europe and elsewhere. But actually what they are now doing is running their funding operations out of the Gulf, and their transaction currency of choice is cryptocurrency. of course, because although the transactions are visible on the blockchain, the identities are very hard to see. And the Russian intelligence service obviously have been playing around with this. Ilan Shori in Moldova was a good example. Tens of millions flowing into Moldovan politics in cryptocurrency transactions. So you've got some quite dark money involved in this. And actually the underwritten story is the influence of the American Christian right. So the American Christian right is also flowing over the last 10 years or so, around about $1 billion into a group and network of charities, philanthropists, legal campaigners, fighting populist causes in the courts and in the public domain in European politics as well. So, you've got very significant amounts of money going into building these kind of influence networks, but the hard core of it, in our country at least, we can at least get a sense of. So when you put all of that together, you can see that you've got some fundamental forces that are driving the demand side for populism, but my goodness, you've got some really well-organised thinkers and financiers who are organising the supply side too. Now, the sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed that Christopher Chandler and Mr. Harborne, so two of our top 4 funders, well, they're not actually based in Britain. Christopher Harborne is based in Thailand. And last time I checked, Mr. Chandler is based in the Gulf. He's a New Zealand citizen originally. All of them, however, made their money in financial services, in hedge funds and trading. Now, for those of you who aren't traders, there's a notion in trading called the long straddle, where you can basically buy a put and a call option on a long-priced asset, which means that you profit enormously if there is a big volatility in the movement of that price when it comes to call it in. So these folks, if you like, I'm sure this is a coincidence, these folks make fortunes from volatility in politics. Now, I ask you, who can be guaranteed to bring volatility to economic policy? Well, it's the populists. So is it right that we allow people who profit from volatility to finance the volatility of politics? It's a really important question that is about to come to the stage of the House of Commons when the elections bill comes back in the next session. So, what are we going to do about it? So, the biggest question that I got asked while I was writing the book was, is this 1933? Are we at a kind of a 1933 moment? And I spent quite a lot of time talking to historians of Weimar Germany. And I came to the conclusion that actually we're not at 1933. We're probably round about 1927. We are maybe one stock market a crash away from something really quite bad happening. And I don't think we're going to see a repeat of the kind of extremism we saw in the 1930s. But there is a lesson from Weimar Germany that it is important to remember. This is the leader of the SPD in the early 1930s. And what a lot of Weimar historians said to me is, well, look, the SPD, they were doing their best, but they were incredibly cautious in the way that they tried to defend Weimar. They used constitutional methods, and they thought that you could get things sorted out in the courts, and, you could just kind of make, virtuous speeches, and basically it would all kind of be okay. And, of course, they were fundamentally wrong. The strategy of caution in the face of extremism fails. And, in fact, the better lesson is from this guy, Franklin Roosevelt, who is also elected in 1933 with that great message delivered at his inauguration, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, who does not relent from a fight with the vested interests that he thought were ruining America. What Roosevelt does is he rides the anger, he rides the tempest, and he uses that kinetic energy that comes from that surge tide of anger to remake the progressive settlement for new times. And my argument to you tonight is that Franklin Roosevelt, not the SPD of the 1930s, are the better guide to what the mainstream of politics needs to do today. Now, if there's hope, this is it. I mentioned that we had looked in some detail at reform voters because what I wanted to prove, thanks to some people in the room here, through a lot of polling data from YouGov and for Better Britain, was that in our country, at the least, reform voters are not one army marching in unison. Actually, when you study it, there are at least 5 different tribes of Reform voters. Now, the most hardcore of Reform voters are what we call disgusted disruptors, majority men, often living in very deprived estates, often in suburbs of cities. Over 90% are nailed on to vote for Reform at the next election. Left behind collectivists, slightly different, more motivated by public services, but still 85% pretty much going to vote for Reform. Traditional Conservatives, again, will have left school earlier, made themselves a bit of money in business, largely retired now, done okay, can afford a couple of holidays. Again, once upon a time they would have voted Conservative. They're sort of Thatcherites in many ways. But, again, 80% are going to vote for Reform. The melancholy middle and the civic pragmatists, however, are a bit younger, a bit better off, much more pragmatic and open-minded, and a far smaller fraction is going to vote for Reform at the next election. Now, I'm just going to suggest this. If you are a mainstream party, either the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, trying to set your message strategy against folk who you are never going to win back is a strategic error. And yet, what a lot of mainstream politicians have been doing for a lot of the last 2 years is calibrating their messages against people who are never coming back to mainstream politics, rather than targeting these good people who are much more persuadable. They're the tractable voters that can come back. Now, when you add all of these numbers up, it tells you something important. 40% of the Reform vote can be won back to mainstream politics. Not just the Labour Party. The Labour Party will pick up a bit of this. But certainly the Conservatives, the Lib Dems and potentially the Greens could all take big votes. So Reform is very beatable at the next election, but not if you start having mainstream politics set their message strategy and their policy strategy by people who are intractable. So understanding exactly who is in play and who isn't is incredibly important. Now, this is the second kind of dimension to this. It's a bit of work Bobby Duffy did from King's College London for us. If you look at kind of different attitudes, let's just take, so we took a bunch of dimensions like, so do you want a strong leader, climate change, welfare state, NHS, EU? What you see between these groups is actually a really wide diversity of attitudes. So look, your disgusted disruptors and your left behind collectivists, these are your really hardcore Reform voters. They overwhelmingly think you just need a strong leader to break the rules. But, that is not a view that is shared to the same strength by other tribes. What about climate change? Look, 70%, 77% of your civic pragmatists, they say we need action on climate change now. That's radically different to your disgusted disruptors. Equally, the welfare state, huge majorities here for universality and welfare state, very different to your disgusted disruptors. Or NHS free at the point of use, or whether you have a closer relationship with Europe. So it's possible to kind of divide this coalition of today's Reform voters by actually focusing on issues that matter. And what that tells you is that you just need a proper political strategy. Before I move off this, one of the truths that this reveals is that the British electorate is now basically bifurcated into two blocks, a left block and a right block. That basically relates to how you voted in the referendum. And so what mainstream politics has to do is to consolidate their block better than the other block. So Reform right now is on a high because it's doing a better job consolidating the right block than Labour is doing at consolidating the left block. Left block really fragmented. Right block not fragmented. And that's why you've got Reform at kind of 25 to 30% and Labour really low, because that vote on the left between Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, Independents is really kind of split and fragmented. And so what this tells you is something like important, and this debate I can guarantee you is going to get lit up after the local elections. There'll be loads of people who basically say, well, look, Labour, oh my goodness, it's had a terrible result. It's just got to shift left. Just got to shift left. Well, that is not quite the whole answer, because in fact, in two-block politics, Labour has to do not one thing, but three things. It does have to unite the left. It's got to be sort of less nasty to the Greens and actually sort of look at some of the sensible ideas the Green Party has got. It's got to keep the right divided, and crucially, it's got to try and flip these two tribes, your civic pragmatists and your melancholy middle, over. And you can't do that by just sort of rushing to one extreme of politics. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than just shifting left. So what does Labour do? Conservatives will have other ideas. I talk to Conservatives about this stuff all the time. I think that basically, this is my provocation, I guess, to you, but also to my own party, is that we've got to kind of counter the populist strategy by doing three big things. One, we've got to have our own story about national renewal. We love our country, we're patriotic, we think the future is there for the taking. Let's be bold about our ambitions for the future, but let's do something that Franklin Roosevelt taught us. 1935, Franklin Roosevelt makes this extraordinary speech at Madison Square Gardens when he takes on the vested minority in America, vested interest in America, and says, I welcome their hatred. I welcome their hatred. He was prepared to have a punch-up with people who he thought were holding the country back. Well, look, on my committee, on the Business and Trade Committee, I can tell you I bring forward in front of the House of Commons a catalogue of villains week in, week out. How is it that companies like Fujitsu caused the Horizon scandal that cost £2 billion for you and me, put innocent people in jail, and they've not paid a penny towards the compensation bill? How is that right? That isn't right. What about the companies that we have to bring in front of us because of allegations about labour abuses, like McDonald's abusing zero-hours contracts and getting involved in sex for shifts at different of their franchise restaurants, or Amazon, who the GMB asked us to get stuck into because of labour problems and health and safety problems, which they deny, by the way, at some of their warehouses? Or what about some of the supermarkets that charge you 15% more at a small convenience store in a poor place than in a big mega store in a rich place? Or what about Thames Water? Or what about some of the other energy companies? We all know that there are vested interests in our economy that are not paying their dues, that are shortchanging their workers and ripping you off on the tills and the bills. Why are we not having a struggle, a fight, a punch-up with those people who are holding back our country by holding back our country's people? I think that sense of struggle, urgency, is something that mainstream politics should be far more bold about embracing. Second, we all kind of like the past, but we don't really want to live there. We've got to be optimistic, not nostalgic about the future. The way we put it in my constituency is building a future with pride in our past. We're incredibly proud of our traditions, but actually we can't roll back the clock because the 1950s weren't as great as people make them out to be. We've got to be optimistic, but that means we've got to have a realistic story about rekindling the opportunity economy. And for me, that is not about spending big money on great big infrastructure in the way that became called Bidenomics. For me, we've got to rekindle small business, freelancers, entrepreneurs, startups. If we want to breathe new life into the high street, you don't do that through big spending programs. You do that by cutting business rates, cutting energy bills, and taking on organised crime that is taking over the high street. If you can breathe new economic life into local spaces like the high street, then you will give people a sense of optimism and forwardness and progress. And I don't think we have quite got that economic strategy right now. Third, we've got to be the party, the mainstream has got to be the place, not of strongman leadership, but of a strong society. And that means strategies to rebuild social capital. Yes, using our best traditions. I call it the patriotism of our best ideals. Not an ethno-civilizational story about our country, but a pride in our country in the tolerance, the rule of law, the democracy, the pluralism, which was actually the secret for how we built this country and how we built Europe and its contribution to the world. But we therefore have to use things like tradition, not as a way of excluding people, but as a living invitation to kind of join in. And what this basically calls for is what we had in Birmingham in the 1880s and 1890s, is what we called the civic gospel. All of these people, millions of people, they came in from the countryside, they left the villages. Remember that great book by Laurie Lee, Cider with Rosie? You know, remember the beginning of it. He talked about the end of 1,000 years of history as he left the village. People went into these crazy new places called the city, and they didn't recoil and say, oh my gosh, this is terrible, we need to retreat back to the farm and the village. No, there was an era of civic inventiveness We invented these associations and clubs and football clubs and sports and culture. We came together as human beings to build new communities. And that's exactly the kind of spirit that we need today. So my kind of to-do list for my party, the Conservatives have a slightly different take, is we need to think about the heroic coalition. Just as Peter Magyar actually defeated Orban by bringing together a coalition of voters, ultimately you can't have kind of one voter. You needed to build a coalition. Put the patriotism of our best ideals centre stage. Take on the selfish minority who epitomise the breach of the fairness code that we think is ruining our country. Let's be progressively optimistic. Let's rebuild the opportunity economy. Let's make sure that we reinvent public services for a new age of AI and digital. Rebuild social capital, fight kleptocracy, not merely populism. Shift to a permanent dialogue, this kind of permanent conversation, and lead, above all, with courage and not caution. These are merely ideas that we have brought together by talking to a lot of people a hell of a lot smarter than me. I apologise that the book is about right-wing populism and not left-wing populism. I know from the feedback that we've had in many of these sessions already that we're going to have to update the paperback when it comes out a bit later in the year with a story about left-wing populism too. But I hope this gives you something to think about. But above all, I hope it gives you hope and confidence and brio as we take on the politics of what is a fast-changing era when there is so much at stake for good people coming together to take good decisions and not bad decisions. David, thanks very much indeed.
All right, if I can get this to work, I'll open it to questions. The woman in the centre. If you want to wait for the mic.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. That was really, really interesting, and I think I'm feeling more hopeful than I was at the beginning.
Okay, job done. Okay.
So I really liked on the second to last slide also on this slide this idea of renewal of kind of binding together around, reorienting how the common enemy, corruption, greed, uniting around that identification. And it reminds me of what the muckrakers did in the U.S. to end the Gilded Age, right? Was all of this investigative journalism and activism to document and build public anger around the robber barons and the horrible things that they were doing to consolidate power, greed, corruption, etc. And there are a lot of people making a lot of noise about that already now, journalists, activists. And we have social media platforms. We have so many more outlets for people to become aware of these things. And I'm just curious why you think parties like Labour, and also the Democrats in the US, and also some center-left parties in Europe, but why aren't they making more noise about that already? The cynic in me might think, okay, it's corporate capture. It's certainly in the U.S., where you had Kamala Harris coming out really strong against some, you're trying to, insinuate reining in corporate power towards the beginning of her campaign, and then she just took this abrupt shift, change, and then that's when her popularity started to flag too. So I'm just curious what your kind of inside view would be on why we haven't seen more of a coalition around this already from parties.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great reference to the muckrakers. I've not thought about that. Thanks for adding that in. That's a really important insight. So look, the basic answer to your question is fear, right? And I sat down with Bernie Sanders once to kind of talk to him about this, and I sort of said, so just kind of help me understand the dynamics of this in US politics. And he told me something that I hadn't quite thought about. He basically said, look, what big money's got the power to do is to stop candidates getting elected. I'd always kind of thought, I'd always thought about it, getting particular people elected, but it's about stopping the opponents of big money getting elected. That's what happens. And I think that fear has really kind of pervaded British politics too, and it was only, really in the last sort of 6 or 7 months that something has flipped, and partly that was the conviction of Nathan Gill, and people kind of realising, actually, do you know what? There's now been a court case that shows that Russian influence is pervading politics. How does that money flow in? And there's been a bunch of us who have been arguing about campaign finance reform since about 2017, 2018. And actually, it's been people like Chris Bryant and Margaret Hodge, and, I've helped where I could. And that's why Steve Reed eventually appoints Philip Rycroft to do the Rycroft Review of Foreign Influence in British Politics. And so the Elections Bill will take on some of this. But what I don't think people have quite understood is the media political complex thing. So Ofcom, Alan Rusbridge has just done a great job on GB News and how Ofcom have systemically failed to regulate GB News. Yet go into the funding of GB News, and you can put money into media systems in a way that's completely under-regulated compared to political systems. And yet, if you're trying to shape and influence an information environment, that's where you put your money, right? And so there's now a group of us who are kind of thinking through what we call epistemic security and information supply chains. How can we now de-risk information supply chains that shape the information environment in our country? And it is going to require not just regulating political finance, it's going to require regulating media finance, and yes, it is going to involve a punch-up with American big tech. And that fight is coming. President Macron actually has been really brave in leading some of that. I can tell you across Europe, this idea is now emerging as one of the top 5 issues that the European left kind of thinks and talks about. So I think the moment is coming, and it's going to be really difficult, and it's one of many reasons why I forecast that transatlantic relationships will actually deteriorate before they get better over the course of the next year, because look, that fight is coming.
The woman in orange. Yes. And I'd ask everyone to keep your questions as brief as possible, please.
Yeah, just building on what Marie was saying, and to add to the optimism, do you see, for example, given your broad views in other countries, other parties that are doing something right? For example, if you were talking about corruption, do you believe that we can take a lesson from the Hungarian election, where corruption apparently during this election and how much they were uncovering, right? Yeah. Is there some hope in that? Again, let me say that again. Are other parties doing something right already that we can imitate somewhere else, asking for a friend who's Italian? That's it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is, my assessment of the answer to that is not yet. But what I've noticed, I don't know why. Now I think about it, I'm not sure quite why it's in the last kind of 3 to 6 months that I've really noticed politicians intensifying this debate. I think it's partly actually, once President Macron kind of broke the mold on we are going to take on American big tech, actually that kind of had an important effect. I mean, Peter Magyar's, my goodness, his first kind of week of interviews taking on kleptocracy in Hungary, that has kind of sobered people up. But also, if you kind of study, the New Yorker analysis of just how much the Trump organization has multiplied its wealth over the last kind of year, some of these numbers are just now becoming so big, they're just unavoidable. And of course, good people are recoiling from this in horror. And so I would say the political mood, the political space within which politicians like me operate is being transformed now as the level of disgust, and it is disgust, and outrage at this kind of kleptocratic behaviour multiplies. So I think hands on heart, I don't see enough progressive parties on right or left really kind of stepping up to this, but I can definitely sense a change of mood over the last 6 months. So that's something.
The gentleman at the front.
Thank you. Very short question. Why has it always seemingly eluded the the left, for want of a better word, or the Remainers, for want of a better word, to come up with the pat slogans that the populist right have always come up with, often just with 3 words: stop the boats, take back control, make America great again. Okay, that's four words. The other side of the argument just has never come up with any sort of pat slogans at all. Why?
No, it's just such a... So I'm fascinated by this, and the book has got a few pages on this, and so a lot of the... So populists are very good at using hard seize words: get, take. It's really, really kind of striking, but there's always a kind of verb at the beginning. And, you know, it's like my brother calls this like an angry parrot. They basically kind of repeat back to you the darkness in your mind. They're like the dark angels of your nature, I guess. But we, I shouldn't tell you this really, but we also ran the semantic analysis on mainstream speeches, which basically revealed how boring they are. And I mean, goodness me, I've made enough of them myself. But the way we kind of characterize it is populists are preachers and mainstreamers are planners. And in social media land, in the kind of information environment that we have today, you need to be preachers. So the book has got some suggestions for how we kind of fix that. But Alistair Campbell asked me this actually. He said, is there anything you admire out of what you've seen from the populists? And I had to think about it, long pause, and then I thought, well, actually, I suppose the one thing that I do kind of admire is their brio and entrepreneurialism. And so somebody once described GB News to me as an £80 million message lab. And actually, that is quite insightful, because what they have been very good at in social media is just setting up lots and lots of different things, running lots of different experiments, almost as random control trials, to kind of test a multiplicity of different kind of language formats to see what has worked. And the reason that they feel comfortable doing that is that they're at the disruption end of the business and we're at the due process end of the business. And so we're kind of due process people because we like rule of law and playing by the rules and all that kind of stuff. And frankly, we have to kind of escape the due process comfort zone and be a bit more comfortable with the disruption end. So we have to sort of reset our kind of balance and our comfort zone. And I think that's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of mainstream leaders. But if we don't rise to that task, then we're just going to fail to cut through. It's the truth.
Gentleman in the middle again.
Hello. I wonder about the connection between populism and incitement to violence, which seems to be very common, and we've seen it on the streets of America, and even the move towards war, because that's always a great distraction and a way of occupying young men who don't have other work opportunities.
Yeah, this is really important. So what we found when we were researching in the early days of Islamist extremism is that...
Sorry, would you mind passing the mic?
Those who were being kind of super radicalised online were often people for who social bonds had broken. So family bonds, community bonds. It's why lone wolf attacks are a thing. And the reason for that is that those kind of bonds and connections to your fellow human beings are constraints. So if you get angry, actually you've got a kind of a web of relationships around you which hold you back. When you've got so many people living in communities that just feel like, in the words of one of our respondents, have been shat on from a great height, and the social capital has collapsed, the bonds that restrain you are weaker, and it is much easier for you to be radicalised. And one of the things that we studied was people's online behaviour. And you've got this kind of new phenomenon now of these rage-tainment producers who are basically producing these kind of really quite provocative bits of content online. When we were kind of watching people looking at the stuff, the thing that we then noticed was on the right-hand side of the screen was that the algorithm was then serving them up this kind of menu of darker and darker material. And so people were kind of being drawn into this vortex down a rabbit hole of very dark material. But when they open the front door, that's what they see. And so I think you're right. It's basically much easier to radicalise people when social capital collapses. And that is one of the big things that is going on right the way across the West. And it's one of the reasons why the populist vote is often stronger in communities where social capital has collapsed. And it's why there isn't a path to beating populism without rebuilding community bonds and relationships. So I hadn't quite appreciated it. It was actually, some security service psychologists that helped explain this to me about 10, 15 years ago. But I can now contextualize it on the streets, I have to say, this is much worse for women. But, the level of violence on the streets now when you're out door knocking and campaigning is like nothing else I've seen in 22 years. I'm going to court in September because somebody tried to attack me doing a gazebo surgery. I've done this for 22 years, every month. Yet, now we kind of get attacked. I now have to have security guards when I do surgeries. Never had to do that before, And yet, for our female colleagues in politics, this is like become normalised for them. So it's really dark and dangerous.
I'm afraid I think that's all we've got time for. It's now 7 o'clock. Sorry?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, the time has flown by. Yeah.
But I would like to emphasise that the book is available here to buy. You should actually take your chance to buy it here for 2 reasons. Firstly, Liam will be on hand to sign it. And secondly, I believe that actually in much of the country it is sold out.
It has sold out, yeah.
So we have a stash of them here.
They've gone to reprint. They have gone to reprint.
We have a stash of them here,
yeah.
But if you don't want to have to wait for the reprint, take your chance, get your book here. But before we do so, I'd like to firstly take this opportunity to encourage you to visit the IPR's website and sign up to our newsletter so you can hear about our forthcoming events. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you to you all for coming and to Liam for speaking to us.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.